All right, so today we're diving deep into Psalm 51, 1 to 2.
Yeah, and we're not just skimming the surface here.
Definitely not.
We're going to look at how pastors are finding these fresh perspectives on it.
Exactly, like for sermons and Bible studies and stuff.
Yeah, pastors are always looking for new ways to make these verses come alive for people.
Totally. And we've got some fascinating material to work with for this one.
Oh, we do. We've
Yeah.
got sermons, commentaries, even some really cool connections to modern day issues.
One thing that really jumped out at me was how many pastors are focusing on God's mercy, but not just as like a theological concept.
It's about going deeper, right?
Hmm.
Actually embodying it in our actions and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Like for Church Kitchener, they bring up this Hebrew word cheesed to describe God's mercy.
And that's way more than just forgiveness.
Oh, yeah.
It's like this unwavering commitment to relationship, steadfast love, loyalty, that kind of thing.
Hmm. So it's not just about wiping the slate clean. It's about that like active pursuit, that constant invitation back into relationship.
Exactly. And they even quote A.W. Tozer. He defines mercy as stooping in kindness to an inferior.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
It really gets at the humility of God's mercy.
It does. And it kind of challenges us to think about how we can embody that same kind of humility and compassion in our own lives.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Speaking of powerful images, I loved the analogy that SMTX used. They compare Finn to a cold, wet day and God's mercy to the warmth of the sun.
Oh, yeah. That's a beautiful one, isn't it? It really captures that feeling of relief and restoration that comes with experiencing God's forgiveness.
Totally. It makes me think about how we as preachers can use these kinds of like relatable images to help our congregations grasp these sometimes, abstract theological concepts,
Yeah, for sure. It's not always easy to explain these things in a way that makes sense to people.
especially if they're not super familiar with the Bible or theology.
Right, and it's not just about finding relatable images. It's also about connecting these ancient truths to modern day struggles.
Right, like Forward Church Kitchener does with their point about smartphones and mental health.
Uh-huh.
They're basically saying even with all this like technological advancement, we can still end up digging these metaphorical holes for ourselves.
Yeah, it's like we think progress always equals happiness, but that's not always the case.
Not at all. And that's where God's mercy comes in, right?
Yeah.
In those moments of struggle, offering us a way out, a
Mhm.
path towards healing.
Exactly. And it's a message that's so relevant for today's world, don't you think?
Totally. With all the pressure to achieve and succeed, it's easy to lose sight of what really matters.
Yeah, it's like we're always striving for something more, something better, but we never seem to arrive.
And it can be exhausting, can't it? That constant striving.
Oh, it can be. But God's mercy reminds us that we don't have to do it all on our own. He's there to help us carry the load.
And it's not just about individual transformation either, right? It's about extending that same grace to others.
Uh-huh. It's
Yeah.
about recognizing that we're all connected and that our actions have an impact on the people around us.
That's something Epworth UMC Rehoboth Beach really digs into, right?
Yeah, they introduced this really interesting idea of a cycle of forgiveness.
Oh, yeah.
Basically, they argue that when we truly experience God's forgiveness, it leads to this deep sense of gratitude.
And that gratitude then overflows into generosity towards others, creating this ripple effect that can transform individuals and communities.
Yeah, exactly. And they illustrate this with a story about an Episcopal priest whose bike was stolen during the pandemic.
Okay, what happened? I'm intrigued.
Well, instead of getting angry or bitter, this priest chooses forgiveness. And you know what he does?
No, what?
He starts a bicycle ministry to bless others.
Wow, that is amazing. Talk about turning a negative experience into something positive.
Right. It just shows you how powerful forgiveness can be. It's not just about letting go of anger or resentment. It's about allowing that experience to transform you and to open your heart to new possibilities.
And it's a great example of how we can use these kinds of real life stories in our sermons to bring these concepts to life for people.
Exactly. People connect with stories. It helps them to see how these truths can play out in their own lives.
Now, another interesting approach came from New Life Church OG. They focused on the distinction between grace and mercy.
Yeah, that's one that can sometimes be a little confusing.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I'm curious to hear how they break it down.
Well, they put it really simply. Mercy is God not giving us the punishment we deserve, while grace is God giving us blessings we don't deserve.
Ah, okay, that makes sense. It's a helpful distinction.
It is, right. It reminds us that both grace and mercy are gifts, not something we earn or deserve.
And I think that's a really important point to emphasize, especially in today's world where there's so much pressure to achieve and perform.
Absolutely. We need that reminder that we're loved and accepted by God just as we are, flaws and all.
And that's something that David in Psalm 51 really seems to grasp, doesn't he? Even in the midst of his sin, he's still seeking God's mercy.
Yeah, he recognizes his need for that undeserved kindness, and it ties back to that idea of cheese we were talking about earlier.
God's unwavering commitment to us, even when we mess up.
Exactly. No matter what we do, he's always there, ready to welcome us back with open arms.
You know, it's really inspiring to hear about all these different approaches to Psalm 51, 1 to 2.
Yeah, isn't it?
It's like there are endless possibilities for connecting with this passage and finding new meaning in it.
There really are, and I think that's what makes it such a rich text for preaching and teaching. There's always something new to discover, always a fresh perspective to explore.
And that's what we're all about here on the Deep Dive, right?
Yeah.
Taking a familiar topic and uncovering those hidden gems that we might have missed before.
Absolutely. And speaking of hidden gems, I think there's one more sermon we should touch on in this section.
Oh, well, which one?
It's from Epworth, UMC, Rehoboth Beach again. They bring up a really interesting point about the historical context of Psalm 51,
Okay.
specifically linking it to the story of David and Bathsheba.
Ah, yes, of
What?
course. That's a key piece of the puzzle. But I'm guessing they go beyond just like rehashing this story.
Oh, definitely. They use it to highlight the truly transformative power of forgiveness. And they make this really interesting connection between David's plea for mercy in the psalm and his actions later on.
Okay, now that sounds intriguing. Tell me more.
Well, they point out that after receiving God's forgiveness, David doesn't just go back to life as usual. Like, his experience of mercy fundamentally changes him.
So it's not just about getting off the hook. It's about allowing that forgiveness to shape who we become.
Yeah, exactly. And that's such a powerful message for our congregations, isn't it?
It is. It's not enough to just acknowledge our need for forgiveness.
Right.
We have to allow it to work in us, to transform us from the inside out.
And that leads perfectly into our next section,
Right.
where we'll explore some of the practical implications of these insights for pastors and Bible study leaders.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to that. But first, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've covered so far. What stood out to you as we were going through these different sermons and interpretations?
Well, one thing that really struck me is how each pastor found a unique angle, a fresh way to approach this passage. We think we know it so well, right?
Yeah, we do.
But there's always more to discover, always a new layer to uncover.
That's so true. And it's encouraging, you know?
Yeah.
It means that we don't have to rely on the same tired interpretations or platitudes. We can dig deeper, find those unexpected connections, and bring new life to these ancient words.
Yeah, and it's not just about finding new interpretations for ourselves, right?
Yeah.
It's about equipping our congregations to do the same. We want to empower them to engage with Scripture in a way that's both meaningful and transformative for them.
That's a great point. And I think it leads perfectly into our next segment, because the big question now is, so what? Like, how do we take all these amazing insights and actually translate them into something practical, something our congregations can actually apply to their lives?
I think we've got some great material to work with. But we'll dive into that more after a quick break.
Stay tuned. It's amazing, like going through these sermons, you can really see how these pastors are going beyond just explaining the text, you know?
Yeah, totally. It's like they're giving us those practical takeaways.
Exactly. Like tangible ways to bring Psalm 51, 1 to 2 to life.
And not just for us, but for our congregations, too.
Right. Like, remember that analogy of stepping out of a cold rain into the sunshine?
Yeah.
You could totally use that to help people connect with the feeling of turning towards God's mercy.
It's so simple, but so effective.
It is, right.
Yeah.
Instead of just talking about mercy, you're helping people to actually feel it.
Exactly. And that's what makes good preaching, right? It's about connecting with people's hearts, not just their heads.
For sure. Speaking of connecting, that story about the Episcopal priest who started the bike ministry
Oh, yeah.
after his bike was stolen.
What a powerful illustration of the cycle of forgiveness.
Right. It really shows how forgiveness is about so much more than just letting go of anger. It's about letting that experience transform you. Open your heart to new possibilities.
And what I love is how it shows how forgiveness has that ripple effect. You know, it spreads outward and impacts others.
It does, yeah. It's not just about individual healing. It's about becoming a source of healing for others.
Another thing that stood out to me was how many pastors were emphasizing the importance of distinguishing between grace and mercy.
Oh, yeah.
New Life Church OG, they did such a good job of breaking that down.
They did. Yeah, I'm glad they brought that up because I think it can be confusing for people.
It can be, yeah. So as a refresher, mercy is God not giving us the punishment we deserve.
Right.
And grace is God giving us blessings that we don't deserve.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. And having that clear distinction can be so helpful when you're teaching on this passage.
It can, yeah. It helps people to understand the depth of God's love for us.
It does. And it ties back to that idea of cheesed God's unwavering commitment to us.
Yes. Even when we mess up, he's still there offering us mercy and pouring out his grace.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
It is. One thing I've been thinking about is how we can avoid making this whole conversation just about individual transformation.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Like, how do we connect God's mercy to the bigger picture?
Exactly. To issues of social justice and compassion.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I'm not sure. It's something that Ford Church Kitchener touched on in their sermon.
Oh, yeah.
They brought up a really interesting point about the rise of smartphones and the corresponding spike in mental health issues.
Right. Now, at first, that might seem like a strange connection.
Yeah, for sure. What does that have to do with Psalm 51, 1-2?
Well, they're using it to illustrate how even things that we perceive as progress can have unintended consequences. It's like we're
Right.
digging these holes for ourselves, even when we have good intentions.
Mm-hmm. So they're saying that even in a world of technological advancement, we still need God's mercy,
Yeah, exactly. We still need that reminder that he meets us in our struggles.
that he offers us a way out of the holes we dig for ourselves.
hmm And they even go a step further and suggest that this understanding of God's mercy should actually compel us to act,
Oh, okay.
to address the systemic issues that contribute to suffering and injustice.
That's a powerful challenge for sure.
It is. And it's a reminder that it's not enough to just receive God's mercy for ourselves. We need to be channels of that mercy in the world around us.
And I think that's where Epworth UMC Rehoboth Beach's idea of the cycle of forgiveness comes back into play.
Mhm.
It's not just about individual transformation.
Right.
It's about letting that experience of grace overflow into our interactions with others.
It is. Yeah. It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected,
Mm-hmm.
that our actions have these ripple effects. And when we choose forgiveness and compassion, we're actually contributing to a more just and merciful world.
I love that. It's a message that I think can resonate with anyone, regardless of their background.
It can. It's about recognizing our shared humanity.
Yeah. And our need for grace.
I'm curious, though, how we present this idea of social justice in a way that doesn't alienate people.
That's a good point. There's so much division around these issues today.
There is, yeah. And it's important to approach these conversations with sensitivity and humility. We're not trying to impose our views or agendas on anyone.
No, definitely not. But we can't shy away from the implications of God's mercy for the world.
Right. We have to find a way to speak truth in a way that's both prophetic and compassionate.
Mm-hmm. And I think one way to do that is to focus on the shared values that underpin these conversations.
Yeah, for sure.
We all want to live in a world where people are treated with dignity and respect, where everyone has access to basic needs, where there's justice and fairness.
Absolutely. And those values are so deeply rooted in the biblical concept of God's mercy. When we understand how lavishly God has forgiven us, it should make us want to extend that same mercy to others.
It should, yeah.
Yeah.
It's about moving beyond a transactional view of forgiveness,
Uh-huh.
where it's just about me and my sins.
Right. It's about embracing a more expansive view.
That encompasses the well-being of our communities and the world.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
recognizing that we're all part of this web of relationships,
Yeah,
that our actions have consequences that extend far beyond ourselves.
they do. And that's where the challenge lies, isn't it?
It is. It's not enough to just acknowledge these truths in our heads.
Right.
We have to let them shape our hearts,
Mm-hmm.
our actions.
And that brings us back to that idea of embodied mercy
It does. It's about putting our faith into practice.
in a way that actually makes a difference.
As we're talking about this, I'm remembering something else that Forward Church Kitchener brought up.
Oh, yeah.
They talked about how God's mercy isn't just a feeling, it's an action.
Yes. And they quoted A.W. Tozer's definition of mercy as stooping in kindness to an inferior.
Right. What a powerful image.
It is. It really captures that humility of God's love for us.
It does. It's not about looking down on people who are struggling or judging them for their mistakes.
It's about meeting people where they are.
Yes. Offering a helping hand, walking alongside them on their journey.
And that's something we can all do, regardless of our position or platform. We can all be agents of God's mercy in the world, just by choosing to act with kindness and compassion.
I love that. It takes the pressure off, Like, we don't have to have all the answers or come up with some grand plan.
Exactly. It's about focusing on the small things, the everyday acts of love and service,
That can make a real difference in people's lives.
and trusting that God will use those small acts to accomplish his purposes.
As we're talking about all of these practical implications, I'm realizing that we could just keep going.
I know, right? This topic is so rich.
But we do want to be mindful of our listeners' time.
Yeah, of course.
But I think we've covered a lot of ground.
We have, yeah.
We've explored some really insightful perspectives on Psalm 51, 1-2, and I think we've made a good start on unpacking what those insights mean for pastors and Bible study leaders.
Yeah.
But I think there's still one more piece of the puzzle we need to address.
What's that?
It's the question of how we equip our congregations to not just understand these concepts, but to really live them out.
Yes, that's the key, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's one thing to have head knowledge,
Right.
but we need to see that knowledge translated into action.
We do. And that's something we'll be diving into in our next segment. We'll explore some practical tools and resources that pastors and Bible study leaders can use to help their congregations embody God's mercy in their families, workplaces, and communities. So stay tuned.
Welcome back. So we've been talking about Psalm 51, 1-2.
We have. And we've seen how pastors are finding all these fresh new ways to approach this passage.
Right, like using relatable stories and imagery.
Yeah, even connecting it to things that are happening in the world today.
And we've talked about how God's mercy isn't just about us as individuals. Wow.
Right. It's about recognizing that we're all connected. And it's about extending that same grace to others.
But how do we actually equip our congregations to live this out?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. It's one thing for us to understand it. But how do we help our people to actually embrace this kind of embodied mercy in their everyday lives?
Well, I think storytelling is a good place to start.
Oh, for sure. We've seen that throughout this whole deep dive.
We have. The sermons that really stuck with me were the ones that use stories to make those abstract concepts come alive.
Totally. Like that story about the priest and the bike ministry.
Yeah. That's a story that you just don't forget.
Exactly. And it's not just about finding the right stories to tell. It's about creating space for people to share their own stories as well.
Oh, absolutely. When we hear how other people have experienced God's mercy and forgiveness, it makes it easier for us to open up about our own struggles.
It does. Yeah, it creates this sense of shared vulnerability that I think is so important for building authentic community.
And speaking of community, I think that's another key piece. We can't just talk about these concepts in isolation. We need to create environments where people can actually practice mercy and forgiveness in the context of relationship.
Yeah, so it's about going beyond Sunday morning, right?
It is. It's about creating opportunities for people to connect with each other throughout the week.
Like small groups or service projects, or even just creating a more welcoming atmosphere at church.
Yeah, exactly. It's about giving people tangible ways to live out these values.
In their families, their workplaces, their communities.
Mm-hmm. And I think another important thing is to give people practical tools and resources.
Oh, yeah? Like what kind of things are you thinking about?
Well, there are a lot of great books and articles out there on topics like forgiveness, conflict resolution, restorative justice, that kind of thing.
Yeah. We could even create some resources that are specific to our own congregations.
We could, like a Bible study on Psalm 51, or a workshop on practicing forgiveness in daily life.
Yeah, love that. And we can't forget about technology either.
Oh, that's right. There are so many ways we can use technology to connect with people and share these insights.
We could use social media, podcasts, online courses. The possibilities are endless.
They are. But, as we're talking about all these different tools and resources, I'm realizing that there's no one right way to do this.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes.
Every congregation is different.
Exactly. What works in one context might not work in another, but I think the important thing is to just be intentional about creating a culture of mercy and forgiveness in our churches.
Yeah, I agree. It's about weaving those themes into everything we do.
From our preaching and teaching to our pastoral care and community outreach.
And it's about remembering that this is a journey, right?
Yeah.
We're all learning and growing.
We are. We don't have to have all the answers or be perfect examples ourselves.
That's such a good reminder. We can model humility and vulnerability.
We can admit when we mess up, ask for forgiveness.
And create a space where it's safe for others to do the same.
As we wrap up, I keep thinking back to that image from Forward Church Kitchener.
Oh, yeah.
About how even with all our technological advancements, we're still digging these holes for ourselves.
It's a powerful image, wasn't it?
I think it speaks to this deep truth about what it means to be human.
We make mistakes.
Yeah.
We mess things up. We get caught up in things that don't matter.
We do. And that's where God's mercy comes in. It's that invitation to turn back to Him,
To start over.
to find healing and wholeness.
And that's a message that we all need to hear.
We do. So as you go and share these insights from Psalm 51, 1-2 with your congregations, remember to emphasize that message of hope and restoration.
Remind people that no matter what they've done, no matter how far they've strayed, God's mercy is always there.
Always.
It's a message that can change lives.
It can. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Psalm 51, 1-2.
We hope you found it insightful and encouraging.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive into a topic that matters.